Good morning. It's been a bit of a while since we did another entry in our History of the Church of England series, so I thought I'd better get back to it. I had a bit of a cough a while ago, which rather interrupted my making videos, but I'm feeling much better now, so back into the grind of things. So, in the first part of this series, we talked about the Henry VIII and how he caused a chain of events which led to the Reformation beginning in England and the English Church becoming independent from Roman Catholicism. In the second video, we looked at the English Civil War and the Stuart dynasty. In this video, we've come into the 18th century, so I'm going to focus on the Evangelical revival and the emergence of the Evangelical party within the Church of England. So, as I said in the last video, spiritually, in the 18th century, England was in a rather low state. The mass of the English people were very poor, and they were very ignorant and poorly educated, and probably most people had rather kind of limited religious knowledge. They would have heard scripture read in church, they would have heard preaching, but a lot of the ministers in the Church of England were very worldly people who were in it as a career rather than out of any genuine spiritual calling. But things rather came to were brought to a bit of a change in the 18th century because a new class, a new breed of evangelical church of ministers arose who were able to preach with power and who made converts amongst the English people and brought in a much greater spiritual knowledge and awareness. And this is connected to events which are often called, particularly in an American context, the First Great Awakening, a revival of religious interest and a great wave of evangelical preaching and conversions. And this was taking place both in England, in Great Britain, and also in America, in the American colonies. These events tied together. Some of the great people in this episode of history, John Wesley and George Whitefield, had ministries in both England and also in the American colonies. Right. So I think obviously John Wesley is somebody that we need to focus upon. So who was he? He was his father had been very much influenced by the Puritan theology, by Calvinism, but his mother, on the other hand, was very much in favour of the High Church party within the Church of England. So I think we mentioned the High Church in the last video. So the High Church, they had been associated with Arminianism, the theological movement in the Netherlands, emphasised free will, though I would suggest that's not the best characterisation of the High Church party. They emphasised the authority of the king and his supremacy over the church. They emphasised the importance of bishops. While they were strongly Protestant, they saw the church as being in continuity with the ancient church, the church fathers, and to some extent the church of the Middle Ages, though of course they repudiated most of the distinctive doctrines of Roman Catholicism. And that was where John Wesley's mother stood. And John Wesley himself, he came to adopt those high church views when he went to college. And he became part of a group of people in college who came to be known as Methodists. Not the Methodist church that emerged as a result of his career, but Methodist was a name given to a group of students who spent a lot of time in devotion, in prayer, and studying the scriptures. Because they were very methodical in the way they did it. These young men came to be known as the Methodists. With all this great interest in religious things, John Wesley naturally became an Anglican clergyman. And he was very interested in mission, and he made the decision to go to America so that he might preach amongst the Native Americans, the Indians as they were called at that time. And while he was on the ship, there was a lot of stormy weather, and he was quite frightened that the ship might be in danger. But he was very impressed by the courage of some European Christians on the ship, who were part of the Moravian Brethren. They were a Protestant sect emerging from what's now Czechia, or the Czech Republic, and there's some in Germany too. They were to some extent evangelical in their outlook, and they were on their way to America because the climate in Europe wasn't necessarily always conducive to religious freedom. A lot of religious sects from Europe made their way to America at that time, and these Moravians were doing so. And John Wesley was quite taken and fascinated by these people, their courage, as I mentioned, in the stormy weather, but also their devotion, their commitment to Christ. And this really got him thinking about his own religious certainties, and he began to have a bit of a religious crisis. He began to think, well, these people have a genuine spirituality. Do I have that? And he had what he described as a conversion experience when he read Luther's commentary on the Epistle to the Galatians, and he said his heart was strangely warmed, and he felt that although he was already an Anglican clergyman, that he had never before been converted, and that now he was a new man. And when he returned to England, he began preaching here, there, and everywhere. He took every opportunity to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ as he saw it. And this caused him a lot of tension, because in England there were strict laws about preaching. So you could, as an Anglican clergyman, you would preach within your parish. If you were a non-conformist minister, you could get a license and permission to preach with certain restrictions. And as an Anglican clergyman, of course, John Wesley was free to preach in his own parish, but he didn't want to do that. He wanted to go and preach in other parishes. And naturally, he had to get permission from the local clergymen within those parishes, and that didn't always happen. As I said, a lot of the clergy at the time were quite worldly people, and they were a bit suspicious of John Wesley with his religious enthusiasm. But John Wesley persevered in preaching the gospel. He went out into the fields sometimes because he wasn't allowed to preach in the churches, and he would stand in fields and he would preach, and many would be converted. But also he faced opposition. As I said, some of these worldly clergymen didn't like what he was doing, and they organised mobs to come and hassle him and the people following him. And sometimes the local landowners wouldn't like it either, and they would be hostile. And John Wesley didn't just preach about the need to be converted. He also preached about holiness and the need to live a more holy and righteous lifestyle, to turn away from alcohol and worldly entertainments. And he began gathering this movement of people around him. Now, John Wesley had no intention to start the Methodist denomination. He had no intention to become a non-conformist. He could have done. He could have got a license and become an independent preacher. But if he'd done that, he would have been banned from preaching within the Church of England. And he very much felt that he was in favour of the Church of England. He supported it. He didn't want to be a non-conformist. But by his own actions, he effectively moved away from the Church of England, inevitably, because he began forming groups of people that were meeting outside of the Church of England setting, outside of the normal parish structure of the church. Now, he didn't intend that these would be like in opposition to the established church, but effectively they were doing a lot of the things that the normal structures of the church were doing. And he actually went so far as to ordain his own ministers within these kind of parachurch meetings. So effectively, he was doing what a non-conformist denomination would do while he was still ordained as an Anglican minister. And eventually, these activities and these meetings, just because they just didn't fit within the Church of England, they effectively, by default, became a new denomination, which came to be known as the Methodist Church, taking that name which he and his friends had been given when John Wesley was at university, the Methodists. I mentioned his emphasis on holiness. This was one aspect of his teaching that's distinctive to Wesleyanism, Wesleyan Arminianism, as it's often called. There's this belief that it's possible to be holy within life. So the more traditional Protestant theology, particularly associated with Calvinism, taught that the Christian life is a life of permanent struggle. You have to struggle against your sins throughout your life. But Wesleyanism taught that it's possible for a Christian to become completely holy, the idea of entire sanctification. Now, Wesley didn't take it as far as some later people within Wesleyan theology did, but there was the idea that it's possible to become completely holy, to turn completely away from sin. As I said, he was an Arminian, so he rejected Calvinism. He believed that we do have free will and we can choose to accept or reject the gospel of Jesus Christ. Nevertheless, he also had associates who identified with Calvinism. During this time of the Evangelical revival, the first Great Awakening, there were many who were Calvinists, possibly more so than Arminians. And John Wesley's brother, Charles Wesley, was also very much in favour of Arminianism. He was the author of many great hymns that are deeply loved in many different churches, such hymns as "And Can It Be?", "Love Divine," or "Love's Excelling," "Lo, He Comes with Clouds Descending." I particularly like that hymn, "Lo, He Comes with Clouds Descending," because it emphasizes the reality of judgment, the idea that Christ is going to come back and you are going to face judgment from God. And that's maybe something that a lot of hymns and a lot of preachers shy away from, but it is a part of our Christian faith that we believe that there is divine judgment, and that there is a possibility that if you reject God, if you reject Jesus Christ, you might well go to that place called hell. It might be an uncomfortable idea, but it is a part of our historic Christian theology, and that's I like the fact that lo, He comes with clouds descending, come to judgment, come away. I don't know what your favourite hymn of Charles Wesley is. Very great hymn writer. Charles Wesley, he was very much associated with John Wesley and his ministry. He didn't always agree with everything that John Wesley did. I think Charles Wesley had an even deeper commitment to the Church of England than John did. He very much regretted the gradual sliding away from Church of England structures that came in the Methodist revival. Some of the associates of John Wesley, George Whitefield, in some respects had a very similar career to John. So George Whitefield, he was another Anglican minister, but unlike John Wesley, he was a very strong Calvinist. He believed in predestination, that God has chosen a certain number of people to be saved, and that God has also passed aside other people to damnation. Yet despite that, he was also deeply concerned to make the gospel known, to call men to conversion. And this is an interesting paradox that many people find difficult to understand, and even a lot of Calvinists struggle with, this tension between, on the one hand, the idea that God's chosen a certain number to be saved, while on the other hand, preaching for people to be converted and to come to Jesus Christ. And that's kind of a slightly difficult theological tension to manage. Some hyper-Calvinists, they would they wouldn't really get involved in preaching, because they'd say, oh, well, God's chosen who's going to be saved, so we don't necessarily need to send out missionaries. But there aren't very many people like that. It's more common for Calvinists to hold those two things in tension. On one hand, the predestination; on the other hand, the free preaching of the gospel. And George Whitefield preached that. He knew Wesley and got on very well with him. They were friends, but they also disagreed about this issue of Calvinism. And George Whitefield, although he was an Anglican clergyman, he also ministered, like John Wesley, outside of the Church of England. And a lot of congregational churches owe their founding to George Whitefield and his preaching. The Countess of Huntingdon churches. There's an aristocratic lady, the Countess of Huntingdon, and she was very enthusiastic about George Whitefield's preaching, and she financed the starting of many independent chapels that were preached George Whitefield's Calvinistic evangelical theology. And in Wales, there was a group, the Calvinistic Methodists, who were very similar in their structure and activity to the Wesleyan Methodists, but who, like George Whitefield, followed Calvinistic theology. And George Whitefield, like John Wesley, he'd ministered in America and was an influential figure in the first Great Awakening, that evangelical revival in America, which established evangelicalism, evangelical Christianity, as the religion of the United States, as it would come to be after the American Revolution. And we see that today. There's a very strong evangelical subculture within America, and certain states are considered to be part of the Bible Belt, where perhaps a majority of people might identify with evangelical Christianity. I don't know what your opinion is of that. Maybe you're somebody who respects evangelicalism, or maybe you're somebody who finds evangelicalism something rather obnoxious. Of course, unfortunately, evangelicalism has kind of developed in America this association with Donald Trump and some of the worst instincts in right-wing politics, which is rather tragic, really. Growing up in England as an evangelical, I very much felt that evangelicalism was non-political. I never felt that the people within the churches I attended expected you to vote Conservative. Some of us did, some of us didn't. Our evangelical Christianity was non-political, which is very different to the kind of American evangelicalism, which, although not necessarily always, but to some extent has become associated with right-wing politics, with the American Republican Party. It all seems very tragic. Other figures in this time who were important in evangelical revival, other Anglican clergymen: August Toplady, a really strange name, isn't it? Toplady. Robert Hawker, and Charles Simeon was another Anglican clergyman. Most of these were Calvinist preachers, and they established a party within the Church of England. Now, this party came to be known as the Low Church, but originally Low Church didn't refer to evangelicals. The reason why evangelicalism came to be known as the Low Church Party was because of their opponents at times were high church men, the people in the Church of England who emphasised tradition, who emphasised the prayer book, who emphasised the authority of bishops. Whereas the original Low Church Party, before the evangelical revival, had been those who were also opponents of high church, but who were more liberal in their theology, like the Cambridge Platonists. We mentioned some of that in the last video, these people within the Church of England who were moderates, who were suspicious of religious enthusiasm and felt that things needed to be reasonable. Not too sceptical, but at the same time not too overly zealous. But the word Low Church came to be associated with the evangelical party. And this emerging evangelicalism had different impacts. So there was the birth of the missionary movement. So at the end of the 18th century, you had the foundation of the Church Mission Society, also the British and Foreign Bible Society, which provided translations of the gospel into many different languages and sent it around the world. There was a huge explosion in evangelical missionary activity at the end of the 18th century. Now, the Catholics have been sending out missionaries for a long time, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Jesuits, the Society of Jesus in particular, was particularly important in sending out missionaries around the world, particularly within the Spanish and Portuguese empires. But also the Dominicans and the Franciscan orders had sent out missionaries. The Catholics were there out in the mission field, trying to make the Catholic Church as big and enormous as possible. By the 17th century, the Roman Catholic Church was truly a global institution. It had converts all around the world. But the Protestants were quite slow in getting in on the act. There are various historical factors that can account for the slowness of Protestants to become a missionary faith. But in the 18th century, that changed with the Evangelical revival. There was an enthusiasm for missionary amongst British Protestants. And we had Robert Carey, a Baptist minister, who was particularly led to go to India to make converts. He got into a big fight with his own denomination, the Baptist Church, because a lot of people within the Baptists were not very enthusiastic about mission. They thought, well, this is a divine matter. They were Calvinists, and they kind of wanted to leave it to God's providence. There's a story that when Robert Carey, the great Baptist missionary, gave his presentation about the need for mission to the heathen in India, he was told by another minister, "Sit down, young man. If God chooses to save the heathen, he won't need your help doing it," or something along those lines. That might be apocryphal, I'm not really sure. Some of the historians watching this can tell us. But yes, different denominations with a strong evangelical faith began to feel the need to send missionaries out. And this, of course, coincided with the beginnings of the British Empire. So you had the American colonies that broke away, but you also had the East India Company, which came under the control of the British government in the 18th century. So more and more parts of India were coming under British rule. And with a greater British rule across the world and more British colonies, there was there was the opportunity for missionary activity by not just the Church of England, but also by the non-conformist denominations, the Presbyterians or Congregationalists, and the emerging Methodist Church, and the Baptists, of course. And with that kind of evangelical spirit, there's an increasing cooperation between evangelical Anglicans and nonconformists. So many of these evangelical clergymen who identified with evangelicalism felt that they had more in common with Baptists or Methodists or Congregationalists who had that evangelical commitment to conversionism, and they felt there was more in common than divided them from those people. So there was increasing cooperation. So the British and Foreign Bible Society had people from both the Anglicans and the Nonconformists working together for this cause of making the scriptures known across the world. We might ask at this point, how do we define evangelicalism? The usual definition is provided by a chap called David Bebbington, who identified 4 characteristics of evangelicalism. So he mentioned crucicentrism, so the centrality of the cross of Jesus Christ and the message of the atoning blood of Christ that saves people. Biblicism, the idea that the scriptures are authoritative, we must believe what the Bible teaches. And conversionism, the need for personal conversion, that it's not enough to just go to church every Sunday, but you also need to have a kind of personal experience of faith in Jesus Christ. and also activism. He identifies that last characteristic of being activism, the idea that you need to be active in working to serve Christ. So if you go to an evangelical church, probably you'll get involved in some sort of activity, maybe knocking on people's doors, or getting involved in a music group, basically doing something to make the gospel known to people in the world. Now, those characteristics are a little bit vague, and I had a slight argument when I did my PhD thesis. So I did a PhD in historical theology, and one of the points I made in my PhD thesis was that Bebbington's 4 characteristics of evangelicalism, crucicism, biblicism, conversionism and activism, were a little bit vague, and a Roman Catholic might have all those characteristics. And one of the professors who was grilling me in my oral exam said, well, hang on a minute, what about conversionism? Surely a Roman Catholic wouldn't necessarily be that into conversionism. And I said, oh, I'm not sure about that. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church still wants to convert people. At the time, of course, I hadn't actually become a Catholic, but a few years later I would be converted to the Roman Catholic Church myself. I think possibly that professor, he wasn't terribly familiar with Catholic devotional literature. If you read a lot of Catholic spiritual books, you'll actually find they do talk an awful lot about conversionism and the need to be converted. Maybe they don't necessarily always mean exactly the same thing as evangelicals would, but the concept of conversion can be found within Catholicism. But anyway, most books that talk about evangelicalism will talk about Bebbington's 4 marks of evangelicalism: crucicentrism, biblicism, conversionism, and activism. There was a kind of shared legacy amongst both Anglican and non-conformist evangelicals. They all looked back to the Puritan legacy. So we talked in a previous video about the Puritans, these men within and outside the Church of England with a Calvinistic theology who felt the need to go back to a kind of more pure form of Protestantism. And evangelicals read some of those same books that the Puritans had written and admired their legacy. And that was a kind of a common feature of both Anglican and non-conformist evangelicals. Okay, so there continues to be a significant evangelical party within the Church of England. Some would say that they're the most enthusiastic Anglicans, that they have some of the strongest parishes, and that they make lots of converts, and that they give lots of money. So to some extent, some of the evangelical parishes are some of the most wealthiest parishes because of all of the generous donations they get, and they are an important part of the Church of England. And as I said, you may have mixed feelings about evangelicalism, but they play an important part within the life of the Church of England today. And that's their beginning. So I think in the next video, we're probably going to talk a bit more about the High Church Party and about the Oxford movement and the Anglo-Catholicism, which came and to some extent went into conflict with evangelical Anglicanism. So thank you very much for listening to this video. I've droned on quite a bit, but hopefully you will have found it informative. Bye-bye.